Hello, my name is Monique Hyman, and I'm a first year PhD student of history at Florida State University. This thesis focuses on the representation of African American and Mexican American histories in state adopted Texas textbooks between the years of 1965 and 1980. The periodization of this study covers the highly polarized period of American politics, the civil rights movement, and the period of revolutionary multiculturalism that succeeded it. These textbooks are analyzed as institutional responses to the civil rights movement and subsequent power movements of Blacks and Chicanos. This thesis is organized into three chapters, each of which covering a 5-year period. In the first chapter, from 1965 to 1970, the texts that were adopted in Texas were emblematic of the dominant strand of American history that had been embedded into public school curricula up until the mid 20th century. African Americans were presented as feeble minded, and Mexican American histories was only presented in instances of war and foreign conflict. This further situated them as foreign threats to the United States. In the second chapter, from 1970 to 1975, the representations of African American histories evolved. However, this was done using the contribution approach, coupled with superficial discussions of slavery and oppression. These incoherent stories produce clashing narratives of extraordinary minority success, as well as isolated instances of racism and oppression. The histories of Mexican Americans distorted further into instances of war and foreign conflict that were threats to world democracy. The freedom struggles of Mexicans, Latin Americans, and Mexican Americans were presented as civil wars that derived from civil instability that led to dictatorial leadership and corruption. The overall representation of African Americans and Mexican Americans in adopted Texas textbooks was mixed at best. Through the contribution approach, the representation of these minority groups measurably increased. However, the most damning representation of these groups prevailed through this period and into the 1990s. Ultimately, sanitized depictions of history of these groups won out in the final quarter of the 20th century. For decades, debates over Texas adoption in textbooks have centered on racial and ethnic inclusion, with Mexican Americans and African Americans at the forefront of this discourse. Texas also is one of the largest textbook buyers in the country. Its textbook decisions heavily affect the adoption market for the national market. Furthermore, Texas sits at the epicenter of the immigration narrative, a narrative shrouded with forced labor, genocide, and colonial expansion. It therefore offers a unique point of departure to how the teaching of history reflects history itself. Thank you.